Welcome everyone to this month's version of the Soil Health Nexus Digital Café. I'm actually pretty excited about this topic, the profitability of cover crops economics, because that's something that always comes up all the time, and we have one of the best to talk about it today. So let's kind of get started. If I can get my slides to move. The Soil Health Nexus Cafe series, we kind of started it as part of the Soil Health Nexus, and we're a group of university-led individuals that our goal and role is to increase the knowledge of research-based information and resources on soil health. Our team consists of representatives from all the North Central region states, the land-grant universities. So our format for today, we're going to have we'll start with our presenter. Rob Myers is going to give a presentation for about the first 25 minutes to a half hour, few Q&A afterwards, and we'll have an opportunity to go into the breakout rooms, and you'll have an opportunity to go into whichever breakout room you choose: researcher, educator, agency farmer, students. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Dr. Rob Myers to talk about cover crop profitability. Rob, thanks for joining us today, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that very much. I'll go ahead and share my slides here. Okay, and hit the presenter view. I just got to move things up a little. Okay, you seeing those slides, Paul?
Yes, very good. Thank you, Rob.
All right, thanks again. Well, so first of all, glad to be with you all today and talk about what's a very important topic for farmers thinking about cover crops, which is, are they going to cost them money, or are they going to get something back from using these cover crops beyond the things we're well aware of, like erosion and soil health benefits? So some of you are aware that we put out a publication that I'm going to be summarizing for you today that was through the USDA Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program, or SARE. And this technical bulletin is available for free online, or you can request as many print copies if you want, if you need some for a meeting. This publication goes into more depth than I will have time for today about the economic analysis that we did based on the National Cover Crop Survey that's been done for several years of farmers from across the U.S. But basically what we did is not only try to summarize in general what we learned about cover crop economics, but also look at some specific management scenarios to see how they impacted cover crops. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into this. The easy part with cover crop economics is, of course, really looking at the cost associated with planting the cover crop. And I think most of you on the call are familiar with the fact that we have a wide range of seed costs out there. In our survey data, farmers were paying an average of about $25 an acre. Now, I will say that included some horticulture users. Our survey respondents were about 80% row crop users and 20% horticulture users. And typically, the horticulture users will pay a little bit more because they don't have as many acres to put the cover crops on. They may be more likely to use a mix with legumes that could be a little more expensive. We do see farmers that are having much lower seed costs, especially if they're just doing something like cereal rye. And even a straightforward application of cereal rye or oats could vary quite a bit depending on the seeding rate that they're using. So we have farmers that are paying as little as $10 an acre, maybe even a little less depending on the year. And then planting the cover crop seed varies widely as well, depending on the technique. If they're using like an aerial applicator, it might be as much as $15 or more an acre. If they are doing it themselves with a grain drill, that may be less, depending on the width of the drill and the cost of the equipment. We see more and more farmers that are finding efficient ways to do it, like using a vertical tillage tool, or maybe broadcasting the seed with a fertilizer spreader, with or without fertilizer in that spreader. So there's a pretty wide range of costs there. But we assume, for purposes of this study, $12 an acre. And then termination's an interesting one. We find in our surveys that the majority of farmers say that they're doing the same thing for their cover crop termination they would be doing anyway, in terms of a spring burn down application, typically with glyphosate or possibly a second herbicide product. Of course, we have some farmers who are using winter kill cover crops that don't have a termination cost. So for purposes of this analysis, we assumed no extra termination cost, even though obviously in some cases that might be occurring. So total cost for our purposes was 37 an acre. I'll just reemphasize, we have farmers that are doing it for less and some that might have higher costs. So then looking at the seeding, just to say a bit more about that, the other thing I've seen happening is we're seeing farmers looking at, can I use maybe a row crop planter to get more acres on efficiently? Maybe that allows me to lower the seeding rate as well because I'm doing that precision application. And like I said, we see people using trips they're already making across the field, like with vertical tillage, maybe a seeder that's on a combine, or other ways that they can do it less expensively. So again, 37 an acre on cost. Now the return side is the more challenging part to evaluate. So yields factor in, of course. Are there any lower costs in terms of fertilizers or pesticides or other changes? And then the resiliency is kind of an interesting thing to look at too, because that can greatly affect the returns in any one year. So let's look at each of these in turn. First of all, with yields, some of you have seen this data before, which is from, again, the National SARE CTIC survey. Typically, we'd have about 500 farmers a year providing this data, varied a little from year to year. And we asked the farmers if you had cover crops in fields that had similar management to other fields that you have with no cover crops, because keep in mind, most farmers aren't 100% cover cropped. What were your yield comparisons? And that wasn't all the farmers surveyed. We might have had 2,000 farmers filling out the survey, but only a fourth of them would have that yield comparison that they could make. So we looked at that data. Most years for corn, it was pretty modest, like 2 to 3% on average improvement from the cover crops. Soybeans was a little higher, 3 to 5. The big year that stood out was 2012 with the drought, and we saw, a much more positive response in that year. Another thing we found in looking at the data where we could look back and say, how many years have you had a cover crop, was that the longer they used the cover crop, the bigger the yield response they got. In fact, the first year of use of a cover crop, there was often, on average, a negligible yield difference. It took time for the soil to change, and it also took time for the farmers to get experienced enough with the cover crops to do a better job managing them. So we focused in particularly on 2 years, 2015 and 16, and this analysis I'm talking about was done in 2019, when we had data where we could really track how many years a farmer had been using cover crops in the field in relation to the yield data. And so we did a regression analysis that provided these yield results. That in corn, again, very minor yield difference in year 1. By year 3, just under 2%, and by 5 years, still modest at 3% yield advantage to using cover crops before corn. With soybeans, it was a little stronger response, showing up more quickly in year 1, and by year 5, having a 5% yield impact. Now, I want to emphasize these are averages of about 500 farms. So obviously, there were farms that did have a yield loss. There are other farms that had no difference in yield. And there were farms that had a bigger yield response. Sometimes we know with corn, particularly with cereal rye or other winter cereals, there can be a yield loss because of nitrogen impacts, and could be other factors that come in, including termination pattern and so on. But this is what the farmers were reporting. So taking those yields and then looking at some very minor factors like not having to do erosion repair and very modest changes in fertility in the 3rd and 5th year of use. We saw this kind of pattern in our analysis with the return on cover crop profit. So in the first year, it was definitely a cost. You can see it's costing a net cost of about $30 an acre on corn, $23 for soybeans. But by year 3, we were breaking even and getting a very small positive return. And then in year 5, a more positive return, about $17 an acre positive return for corn, and $10 an acre for soybeans. So one thing I would say is, we don't know how things look 10, 15, 20 years down the road, but presumably those net profit positive returns are going to continue. Again, this is on average. We know other farmers, may have had different experiences. So just a few details. This was 2019 data when crop prices were quite a bit lower. So with higher crop prices now, that would make the situation look more favorable. Again, we were assuming a very small benefit for erosion repair and a small benefit starting in year 3 on weed control savings. Those baseline returns, there's more details in the report if you wanted to get into that, but the bottom line is that there is a net cost in year 1. So we know that this makes some farmers hesitant to use the cover crops. They're going to say, well, I need to focus on paying off my operating loan this year. So, I'm hesitant to try a cover crop because it's going to cost me money. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. One thing we do agronomically in a lot of our Corn Belt states, if we have pHs that are on the low side, is we go out and lime those fields periodically. If you look at a lot of the literature on liming fields, it takes time for the soil to react, and it's considered to be a 2 to 3 year payoff to do that liming operation. And yet that is a very commonly accepted operation in areas that tend to have low pH soils. So I think that's an example that we can share with farmers to talk about how when we look at cover crops, we need to look at that multi-year aspect. In a different way, of course, when farmers are buying equipment, whether new or used, they're looking at a multi-year return. So I think that's part of our challenge as educators working with producers, is to think about how to communicate in a meaningful way that that cover crop investment is really something they need to look at in a multi-year fashion. However, we also recognized when doing this analysis, the team of us that worked on this, that there are different management scenarios that lead to different results in terms of when that cover crop is going to pay off. And we broke it into 7 different categories that those management scenarios might be. The first one being herbicide-resistant weeds. We all know that these are becoming more common across the Corn Belt. On my own family farm in Central Illinois, we had none of these going back till about 5 years ago, and now they're becoming very common in our fields. And so our farm, we have 2 tenants that farm our family ground in Illinois, because some of the ground's spread out. And they're both finding really positive results from using the cover crops with some of their herbicide-resistant weeds, particularly mare's tail and water hemp. So for our analysis, this was tough because there can be such diverging scenarios for what people are paying for herbicides and so on. But we talked to a number of herbicide dealers, looked at the survey data, and in this case, the estimates were that there would be an extra herbicide savings of about $27 an acre if a farmer was battling herbicide-resistant weeds. And that would allow the cover crops to pay off in year 2 for corn instead of 3 years, and actually pay off in 1 year for soybeans. So that's a pretty dramatic change from having to wait 3 years for that net payoff. Now, this is coming about because of some assumptions we're making. First of all, we're seeing that the majority of farmers are saying they're having these herbicide-resistant weeds. We did not assume any change in yield, even though there might be a yield loss from the herbicide-resistant weeds or some grain dockage. But what we did find in looking at the data was that a lot of farmers, let's say their normal program in a regular field would be 1 post-emergence application. So what are they doing if they're getting these herbicide-resistant weeds? Well, often they're shifting to doing a second post-emerge application, and they're moving to a more expensive residual herbicide chemistry. So in our analysis, we assumed that there was a savings based on using 1 fewer post-emerge application. In other words, instead of doing 2 or maybe 3 applications, we're going to do 1 less, so probably 1 application. That's going to have a savings of $12 an acre, again at 2019 prices. And then we're going to use a less expensive residual herbicide, so $15 an acre savings there. Obviously, that could vary tremendously depending on the farmer's individual program. So that's where the 27 came from. Okay, here's a second scenario, compacted soils. We know that this is increasingly an issue with bigger and bigger equipment. We saw in some of our recent years where we had wet falls. This year was a dry fall, but when we've had a wet fall, this has been a real problem. So what do? Well, we normally go out there with a pretty high horsepower tractor and some subsoiling equipment, and we try to, loosen up that soil. And that can work, but often, unfortunately, it's a short-term solution because that subsoil can swell back together. Interestingly, Ohio State University did a multi-year study on this, looking at how using a subsoiler compared to using cover crops. And although the subsoiling can be effective in the short term, they found that cover crops seem to be an effective long-term solution because of the rooting action and other factors like earthward action. When we look at University of Minnesota machinery cost in 2019, that was about $15 an acre for doing the subsoiling. That's machinery, labor, and fuel all combined into one figure. And if we can replace that with a cover crop, then that helps the cover crops pay off in year 2 for soybeans and break even in year 2 for corn. So a positive benefit there when we have compacted soils. The third scenario was fertility costs. We know that fertility costs really jumped up here in 2022, probably going to remain high this coming year. And so farmers are paying more attention to what they can do to addressing that. Or maybe they've got a field they've rented that has pretty poor fertility. So in some scenarios, not every cover crop scenario, but in some scenarios where we're assuming that that cover crop can really help with fertility, putting a legume in the mix before corn, letting it grow long enough to contribute some nitrogen credits to the field, or maybe over time on soybeans starting to build up phosphorus and potassium availability from higher organic matter, that where those cover crops are helping, that's going to help pay off a little more quickly. Not enough to really make a difference for soybeans. We were still saying 3-year payoff for soybeans, but moving things forward by a year for corn to paying off in 2 years if we had a small nitrogen credit. And we know that that often is small because we're not letting that legume grow very long. Now, the fourth scenario is an interesting one. Interestingly, as we look at what's happening with soil health nationally, a lot of farmers that are trying cover crops start saying, well, what else can I do to improve my soil health? And of course, they're hearing about the benefits of reducing soil disturbance. So we do find that there's a fair number of farmers trying cover crops that then move to no-till. We also know that no-till has been kind of labeled as being something that you're going to have potentially a yield dip, where you just adopt no-till by itself, probably from compacted soils, also less effective distribution of the nutrients and the profile initially. So when we add the cover crop, it seems to counterbalance that compaction by helping reduce some of those compaction effects of having no-till alone. We also, with earthworm activity and greater macropores, get a little better distribution of nutrients into the profile. And so we're assuming here some savings that would amount to about $24 an acre. That would allow the cover crops to pay off a year faster for corn and 2 years faster for soybeans, actually in the first year of use. And looking at the details here, again, we're assuming that normally we would have that yield dip with no-tilling alone, but with cover crops, there's some data, and I would say we need more research on this, but there's some data that would indicate that the cover crop is helping avoid that yield dip, at least in a fair number of cases. So in that situation, we can maybe eliminate that fall tillage operation, such as a fall chiseling, that would be valued in 2019 at $11 an acre, and then not need that spring seedbed application. Grazing cover crop, scenario 5. We know that this is often cited as one of the more profitable ways to use cover crops. What we did was we had an economist do a hay replacement model with the cover crops. He found a return of $49 an acre. I've seen other figures higher and lower, looking at rate of gain savings and so on. But based on a hay replacement model, what we looked at here was that the cereal rye conservatively might generate 1,500 pounds of dry matter an acre. It could be more than that, but that was a conservative figure. But you're going to lose about half of that biomass from hoof action and selective grazing. Again, that's a relatively conservative number. So then you're saying you got about 750 pounds that would actually be utilized of that rye, and that could replace a little over 1,000 pounds of hay, because we're assuming that, again, you're not going to utilize 100% of that hay. The cattle are just not that efficient, and the hay is 88% dry weight. At that time in 2019, we're valuing hay at $80 a ton, and then some additional savings from reduced machinery, fuel, and labor costs from not hauling the hay. So you put all that together, and you get a $49 figure. Now, I want to stress that if you had to go out and buy fencing or pay for getting a water supply, that would affect how quick this return is. So we're assuming if you're going to get it to pay off in year 1, that you've either got some electric fencing already available or a water supply. Otherwise, it may take a couple of years to pay off that initial capital cost. Okay, and then I just want to point out what's pretty obvious, which is we are getting incentive payments such as from EQIP, and here's just some EQIP rates as existed in 19 for several states, that's going to make those cover crops pay off pretty quickly. If we could get at least $32 an acre, that's going to allow those cover crops to be covered by the incentive payment in that first year of use. And most states have an EQIP rate of 50 or more. There's a few like Minnesota, Iowa that have a lower rate, but even those are high enough to cover that cost in the first year. The last point, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly so we can get to the question and answer here. So managing soil moisture is an interesting one. I mentioned the topic of resiliency earlier, and this is kind of where this comes in. So if we have a dry year like in 2012, where we saw that bigger yield response from cover crops, there's some things happening there. What we're doing is we're getting more water to go into the soil, and you can kind of see that here with the cover crops in the middle, that the water is percolating through the soil into the jar underneath the tray, as compared to the tilled soil next to it where the water is running off into the front jar. And so when we flip those pans over, most of you have seen this in a rainfall simulator demonstration. This front pan is the tilled soil, and in back we've got the cover crop, and that water is infiltrating quickly through the cover crop soil. We've got more macropores here from earthworm action, root action, that are letting that water get into the soil. Whereas in that tilled soil, it's sort of sealing shut. The silt and clay in there is sealing that soil shut after a certain amount of rain, and that's preventing that rainfall from infiltrating farther into the soil. And we can kind of see that here where in a tilled soil, we're losing the benefit of macropores. Any roots that have been there, we're kind of disrupting those channels. Same thing with earthworms, and we get more earthworm action when we do have the cover crops. So really these macropores are really critical to getting that rain into the soil. There's other impacts like the mulch benefit of the cover crops, the mycorrhiza helping access water and nutrients, deeper rooting following a cover crop, at least some types of cover crops. So here again, in a year that was particularly dry, we would say that those cover crops could pay off right away in year one. Obviously, that's not going to happen every year, but something to keep in mind as we're looking at the overall profit picture. So just to summarize these aspects of cover crop profitability, I think when we talk to farmers about this, we want to talk about it from a fairly holistic perspective, that we're gaining efficiency by adding the cover crop. It's making the whole cropping system perform better, and we're getting these soil health improvements. We also want to talk about a multi-year timeline, that this is like liming the field. It's not something that's immediately going to pay off in year one on average. It could in certain situations like grazing, or if we have particular weed issues we're dealing with. And that also we're impacting resiliency. It's really kind of a form of crop insurance in a way, I think you could say, to have the cover crops out there. And just like buying federal crop insurance, that premium paid annually may not pay off for 3 or 4 years because it just depends on the weather. But when it does pay off, it'll pay off big. And I think that's something we can say about the cover crops as well. So bottom line, we're valuing these cover crops both for the immediate benefits they provide, like protecting the soil, but also as investment in the long-term success of the farm. And again, you can get this full report online. Just do a search for SARE cover crop economics. So I was asked to just share a couple slides in wrapping up about the SARE program that I work with and how this relates to cover crops. First of all, we have a wide variety of grants available for people, whether you're with a university or other situations. There are 6 different programs we run through the North Central region. If you're in one of the other regions, we have similar programs in those regions. You can see the dollar amounts do vary by the program. The partnership program is one I would particularly mention. We've had a lot of cover crop projects funded through that. That's a great one for extension educators to access because it's intended to do on-farm demonstration, research trials, even education projects with a group of 3 or more farmers. We also have these professional development grants I'll highlight. We've had quite a few of those focus on cover crops. We just boosted the amount on those from $90,000 to $120,000 for this coming spring. So definitely a variety of options here for you to be aware of. Also keep in mind, we do have a wealth of resources, both print and videos on cover crops, if you just do a search for SARE cover crops, you'll find lots of resources that you can tap into. And many of these resources are completely free to use, including our image library that we created that has 500 photos, most of them done by professional photographers. A lot of those are labeled so you can search them. And that's a great resource for you to use. There's also some illustrations and slide sets. So feel free to take advantage of those image resources for your education efforts. So with that, I will stop and be happy to entertain a couple questions before you go into the breakout groups here.
Okay, thanks, Rob. There is one kind of question in the breakout room, but I guess I have a couple just regarding the SARE grants. When is that grant cycle? Are we in the middle of one? Are we at the end of one?
So we have both a fall cycle and a spring cycle. All the grants are due just once a year. So most of the fall ones have already passed, but the Farmer Rancher grants are due December 1st. The partnerships one that I mentioned, those are due in mid-October normally. So you'd have to wait till this coming fall. The professional development ones are really good for extension educators. Those, we haven't set the date yet, but it's usually right around the 1st of April, right at the end of March. And those guidelines will be out in about the 1st of February.
Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I just saw there was a question about, are the dollar figures given on a per acre basis? Yes, those were all per acre dollar figures.
So there's some questions coming in, Rob. So if you wanted,
sure. So
just go in and answer them.
Yeah, it was about the best place to find information on cover crop economics. So again, probably the easiest way to find it is just do a search for SARE cover crop economics, and that'll pull up the report. Or if you wanted the photo library, just do SARE cover crop image library. That'll find you that resource. Okay, then there was a question about what are the variables used in the regression analysis to isolate the yield impacts. So it was a straight comparison where the farmers provided the yield data for fields with cover crops and without, using data from 2015 and 16. We did have the data on how many years they'd had a given field in a cover crop. And so the regression analysis was based on the number of years in cover cropping and the yield figures provided. Okay, the next question was, some numbers I have seen in terms of figures show implementing cover crops are closer to 55 an acre. Did your numbers include termination costs? So that $37 an acre figure I cited, we were assuming the farmer either had a winter killed cover crop or they were using a termination approach that equaled their normal spring herbicide burn down application. The questioner is exactly right. If you did have to do a separate termination operation, that would drive up cost, and you could be closer to $50 if that were the case. And Ann just put the link to the report. Thank you, Ann. Next question was about the biggest obstacle to get farmers to try cover crops rather than tilling. Wow, can we have a whole nother presentation on that, Paul? That's a
Of course we can.
a big one. So the landowners, it's interesting, you know, of course, if they're renting their ground, they're not so concerned about what the farmer's cost is. But I have found my own mom was this way because she was doing you know, what we call a tenant crop share lease with our two tenants. And she was a little hesitant. This is after my dad passed. He had approved the cover crop use. And then when my mom took over making these decisions, she's like, I'm not so sure I want to have cover crops out there. And, you know, how much am I going to have to pay for the seed? So it does become a factor when you've got a crop share and the landowner is paying for it. Fortunately, she was able to go out on a tour for women landowners about cover crops, and that helped change her mind because she certainly wasn't going to listen to me. But yeah, that landowner factor is an important one. Okay, then there's a question. Paul, if we need to switch to your breakout groups, I can.
No, just keep going to the questions. We'll get
maybe the last one. Okay, like the thought process on utilizing cover crops for fertility and Lyme. Yeah, so I just think anytime we can have an analogy to a decision the farmer is already comfortable making, like, hey, I need to do Lyme periodically, and yeah, it may not pay off in year one. If we can help them see that the cover crop's the same sort of thing, you're improving your soil for the long term. It's not just it's not like putting on a soybean fungicide where, you know, it needs to pay this year or why do it. So we've got to think about how we're communicating about the cover crops so that it's in that multi-year mindset.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Go ahead. Is there another?
Yeah,
Question
what
coming.
about the colder climates? Well, it is tough where we have a shorter fall season to get the cover crops in. Of course, we see some farmers doing innovative approaches like seeding the cover crops prior to harvest, or some are even doing it like when the corn is knee high now, which is an interesting model. We see a few that do it at the time the corn is seeded, which is not easy to do, but I've seen some try that. We have seen some farmers that are in places like North Dakota or Minnesota adding a small grain back to their operation that gives them a little earlier harvest time to get that cover crop in, or maybe they're doing it after silage corn where they have a little more time. But no question, it's more challenging to figure out the right approach in the north. That's why we see a lot of cereal rye, because it can go in relatively late, but the questioner's point is well taken.
Okay, I'm going to just make one more comment before we go into the breakout rooms, and I think your comment about your mom wanting to invest in cover crops and the economics, and you know, it was a couple of weeks ago I was on a call discussion with Dr. Laura Van Erd from University of Guelph, and when she responded about when farmers talk about you know, return on investment, I only do those things, and she says, do you change the oil in your combine? Do you grease it? You know, that's maintenance. Cover crops are soil maintenance.
Good point. Yeah.
So there's one more question, and then we'll slip into our breakout rooms.
Well, cover crops in dryland areas has been a big question. If we went back several years ago, there was a lot of concern, and still is among many, that cover crops would use up too much soil moisture, and they definitely can, especially when we look again at the first year of use. But what we're seeing where cover crops are used for multiple years, again, we're starting to change the soil properties. We get more rainfall infiltration, we get more mycorrhizal fungi, we get deeper rooting action by our cash crops. So we start to see that cover crop, even though it's still using some moisture itself, that the overall dynamic of the soil properties is such that soil is performing in a more resilient fashion. So I wouldn't say cover crops totally solve moisture issues in relatively dry areas, but they can be part of our management approach to make those soils more resilient.
Okay, very good. Thanks again, Rob, for presenting today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I'd like to remind people of our schedule. In December, we're not going to have a cafe because of it's so close to the holidays, but join us January 16th of 2023, which I guess we're gonna have to get used to start saying that, when Dr. Marshall McDaniel from Iowa State University is going to talk about prairie strips. So kind of interested in hearing that. So with that, again, thanks to everyone for joining us, and please join one of the breakout rooms for further discussion.